Last night, when the rain slammed against my son's porch like the sky itself was furious, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed as if he were guarding a fortress I no longer belonged to. His voice was flat, practiced, almost rehearsed as he said, "Mom, you can't stay here. You'll only make things harder." Harder. The word hit me sharper than the cold wind slicing across my face. My suitcase sat between us, drenched and sagging, a pathetic symbol of every sacrifice I had ever made for that boy, now a man who couldn't even meet my eyes. I whispered, pleading without meaning to, "I raised you alone, where am I supposed to go?" The tremor in my voice didn't move him. He barely blinked. Behind him, his wife stood stiffly, her lips pressed in a cold, irritated line, watching me like my mere presence was staining her flaws. The silence stretched so painfully that even the rain seemed to hush for a moment, waiting to hear whether a son would choose compassion or convenience. Then the door shifted. Just a little. Then a little more. My heart pounded against my ribs, desperate for him to say something, anything, that proved I still mattered. But he didn't. The door moved closer, closer, until finally, with a soft, final thud, my own son closed it in my face. The sound cut through me like a blade. I stood there trembling on the porch, clutching my chest as though I could hold the pieces of my heart together with sheer will. I couldn't understand how the child I once carried through fevers, comforted through nightmares, guided through every heartbreak, could look at me and see nothing but a burden. The porch light flickered behind the closed door, but not for me. I was no longer someone worth opening it for. Shivering, I turned away, the rain soaking through my clothes until I felt colder than the night itself. I didn't realize that someone else had seen everything. Someone I never expected. From the house next door, a porch light snapped on, revealing the silhouette of my son's boss watching me with a stunned, almost protective expression. And what he did next, well, that changed everything. Stay with me till the end, because what happens next will shock you. And if you love emotional revenge stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more. The moment the door shut behind me, everything began to unravel. And to understand how it reached this point, how love twisted into humiliation, I need to take you back to where it all started. My name is Beatrice, and this is my story. Before everything spiraled into heartbreak, my life moved with a gentle, predictable rhythm. I woke up to the soft creak of my little house settling, brewed my morning tea, and tended to the roses that had grown with me through years of storms and sunshine alike. Retirement had given me something I hadn't felt in decades, peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but a quiet, grateful stillness that felt like a reward for all the battles I had fought alone. Daniel visited often in those days, always walking in with that hurried smile he wore when he wanted to show he cared but didn't have the time to linger. I never minded. I knew life moved faster for the young. He'd sit on my sofa, telling me about his demanding workload, the pressure of his office, the ambition that fueled him. And every time he left, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "Mom, when I make it big, you won't worry about anything anymore." I believed him. Maybe because a mother's heart believes long before logic steps in. His wife, Lila, was polite at first, almost overly polite. She'd compliment my cooking, compliment my garden, compliment the way I kept my home. But beneath that sweetness, I sensed a stiffness, a hesitation I couldn't quite name. She was the type who smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes. I brushed it off, convincing myself she was simply adjusting to married life. There were tiny moments, though barely noticeable, that hinted at something simmering beneath the surface. Like the time Daniel laughed at a childhood story I told, only for Lila to place a hand on his arm and say, "He's an adult now, B.A. You should let him grow out of old habits." Or the way her expression tightened when Daniel hugged me too long, as if affection itself was an inconvenience. Still, I held on to the warmth of our family dinners, the comfortable conversations, the feeling that despite everything life had taken from me, I still had my son. My anchor. My constant. I didn't know then that the foundation beneath us was already cracking. I didn't see the subtle glances, the quiet sighs, the shifting distance. I didn't recognize that love, when taken for granted, can slowly be pushed to the edges without a single raised voice. But the first sign came quietly, just a simple message from Daniel. A message that read, "Mom, we need to talk soon. Something important." I had no idea that was the first shadow before the storm. When Daniel said he needed to talk, I expected something ordinary, maybe work stress, maybe a financial worry he didn't want Lila to know about. But when I arrived at their house that evening, the atmosphere felt strangely tight, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Lila opened the door with a smile stretched too wide. "Beatrice, you're early." I wasn't. I was right on time. But her tone made me feel as though I had already inconvenienced her by simply existing. Daniel sat on the couch, shoulders slumped, his phone in his hand. He didn't look up right away, and a small ache bloomed in my chest because he always used to greet me with a hug. When he finally glanced up, his smile was quick, thin, almost apologetic. "We've just been busy," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. Busy. It was such a small word, but something in the way he said it made it feel like a wall being quietly erected between us. We talked about little things at first, his work, the new project he was leading, the praise he'd gotten from his boss. But every time I asked a question, Lila answered for him, as though she needed to keep control of the conversation. And Daniel let her. That was the part that unsettled me most. When the tea I brought sloshed slightly as I set it down, Lila flinched. Just a tiny movement. But enough for me to notice. "Oh, careful," she murmured softly, even though nothing had spilled. I wondered why she was nervous. Or why she wanted me to feel nervous. After a few awkward minutes, Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom, about the house. We're thinking of renovating. Maybe selling. Maybe moving somewhere closer to the city." "Oh," I said lightly, though a small pang tugged at me. "Well, change can be good." "Yeah," he said. "We just need space. Privacy." Lila's eyes flicked toward me for a second, quick, but loaded with meaning. I suddenly felt like an intruder being gently, politely nudged toward the exit. When I stood to leave, Daniel didn't follow me to the door like he used to. And Lila didn't offer a goodbye hug, only a murmured "drive safe." As I walked to my car, a strange heaviness settled around me. Something was shifting. Something subtle yet unmistakably cold. I tried to push the feeling away, but a whisper of dread crawled up my spine. Later, when I replayed that evening, I realized it was the first time I felt like my son was slipping out of reach and I didn't know how far he would fall. The distance didn't come crashing down all at once. It crept in slowly, like a draft sneaking through a crack you didn't notice until the whole room felt cold. I kept telling myself Daniel was just overwhelmed with work, that marriage brought new responsibilities, that I shouldn't overthink every small change. But some changes are too deliberate to ignore. It started with the cancelled visits. "Mom, tonight's not good. Lila's not feeling well. Maybe next week, I'm swamped with deadlines. Rain check, okay?" Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. But strung together, they formed a pattern. A pattern I didn't want to see. Then came the forgotten promises. The birthdays he used to make special with breakfast surprises. The Sunday calls we never missed. Even the small things, like stopping by to check on me after a storm, became memories instead of habits. One afternoon, I called him just to hear his voice. Lila answered instead. "Oh, Beatrice." His inner meeting. Her tone was polite, but distant. "Is it urgent?" "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "Just tell him I called." She hummed, a vague acknowledgement, and hung up. Daniel never called back. I tried not to take it personally, but when excuses repeat themselves, they start to sound like rehearsals. The real shift, though, came from Lila. Whenever I was near her, I sensed something simmering under her calm exterior. It wasn't hatred. It was something subtler, territorial, calculating. She watched Daniel the way someone watches a prize they were afraid of losing. And when I spoke to him, her posture stiffened, as if my presence alone threatened the life she was building. Once, during a rare family dinner, Daniel mentioned he was considering applying for a senior role at his company. A big opportunity. A life-changing one. "You'll get it," I said proudly. "You've always worked harder than anyone I know." But before Daniel could respond, Lila's voice cut in, sharper than she intended. "Hard work isn't enough. Connections matter. Especially the boss's impression." There was something in her tone, an urgency, a fear that made me glance at Daniel. He looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. In that moment, it clicked. Lila wanted Daniel to move up. She wanted status, stability, influence. And she didn't want anything or anyone interrupting that trajectory. Especially not me. I walked out of their house that night with a sinking feeling. Not because of something Daniel said, but because of everything he didn't say. And deep down, I feared I already knew why. I remember the exact moment I realized something had shifted, subtly at first, but enough to make my mother's instincts tighten like a warning bell inside me. It was the very first weekend I visited their new home. They had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, pretty, clean, with trimmed hedges and polite neighbors. I brought a basket of homemade bread, the same recipe my son grew up loving. I stood at the doorstep smiling, excited to see the place they had both been talking about for months. But when the door opened, it wasn't my son who greeted me. It was her. My daughter-in-law. She didn't smile. She didn't even fake one. She looked at the bread like it was something she needed to sanitize before letting inside. "Oh," she said flatly. "You're early." I blinked. "Am I?" He told me 3 p.m. "It's 2:57, she muttered, stepping aside like my presence was already an inconvenience. I brushed it off. New marriage, new house, maybe she was stressed. Maybe she wasn't used to visitors. I told myself not to be sensitive. But the red flags didn't stop there. As soon as I entered, I noticed she kept looking at her watch, then at me, then back at her watch. Almost like she was timing how long I took to breathe. My son, thankfully, came downstairs with a warm smile and hugged me tight. For a moment, I felt everything was normal. But as soon as he pulled away, she shot him a look so sharp I could almost feel it slice through the room. When I handed him the bread basket, he smiled. But she stepped between us and said, "We're trying to eat healthier now." "But it's just," I began. She cut me off. "Bread isn't good for him." My son's face faltered. "Babe, it's fine. Mom always." She gave him that same daggered glance again, and he shut his mouth instantly. I watched the exchange quietly, my heart sinking. The rest of the visit was no better. Every time I complimented the house, she corrected me. Every time I spoke to my son, she answered for him. Every time I offered to help, she insisted she didn't need supervision. By the time I stood up to leave, she had already opened the door, subtle, but clearly intentional, as if she wanted to usher me out before I changed my mind and sat back down. My son hugged me goodbye at the doorway, but she was already walking away, calling his name impatiently. And that's when I finally admitted to myself. Something was wrong. Maybe she didn't like me. Maybe she didn't want me around. Maybe she resented the bond one had with my son. I didn't know the full truth yet. But I would soon learn that this wasn't just dislike. This was the beginning of a slow, calculated push, one that would eventually drive my son to say the words I'd never imagined hearing. "Mom, you can't stay here." And that was only the start. At first, the changes were so small that I almost convinced myself they weren't real. A shorter phone call here. A delayed reply there. A forgotten birthday lunch we had planned months earlier. Little things, tiny, almost invisible cracks, but when it's your child, your only child, you feel every shift like a tremor inside your chest. My son had always been warm, affectionate, and attentive. He used to call me on his way to work, on his way back, sometimes even during lunch just to ask if I'd eaten. He never forgot a date, an anniversary, a tradition. We had lived through storms together, poverty, long nights, broken appliances, sickness, heartbreak. We were a team. But after the wedding, after her, he became someone I barely recognized. The first real sign was the tone of his voice. It carried a strange stiffness, like he was choosing his words with caution. Sometimes I'd hear his wife in the background, sometimes laughing, sometimes sighing loudly, sometimes whispering something I couldn't make out. Whenever she was around, he cut our conversations short. "I'll call you back, Mom. Can we talk later? Sorry, it's not a good time right now." Later rarely came. Then one day, I asked if he was free on Sunday for a quick visit, nothing big, just tea and homemade rice pudding, his favorite since childhood. His voice went strangely tight. Actually we're kind of busy." "Busy?" I asked gently. "Every Sunday?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Mom, she feels like you visit too often." My heart froze. "Too often? I've seen you twice in 3 months." I know, he said quickly. "Just don't take it personally. She's adjusting. She wants space. Space. From me. I swallowed the knot forming in my throat. And what about you? Is that what you want? He didn't answer right away. Instead, I heard her voice in the background. Not loud, just a sharp, annoyed, "You're still on the phone?" His breathing turned unsteady. "Mom, I have to go." Click. I stared at the phone in my hand for a long time. The next change came in the form of money. He had always insisted on helping me. Not because I needed it, I managed fine, but because he wanted to give back. He once told me, "You sacrificed everything for me. It's my turn now." But suddenly, he stopped offering. Stopped asking if I needed anything. Stopped checking in about my bills or medicine. Then one night, I called him because the electricity in my house kept tripping, and the technician said the wiring needed repairs. He sighed audibly, like my call had interrupted something important. "Mom, I can't help with that stuff right now. Things are tight." "Tight? Your boss just promoted you." "Yeah, but look, just handle it, okay? Handle it." That word stung worse than the rain that would later drench me on his porch. By the time I hung up, the truth had crept into my mind like an unwelcome shadow. He wasn't just changing. He was becoming someone else. Someone who didn't sound like my son. Someone who spoke in careful tones. Someone who flinched when I mentioned his wife. Someone who acted like my presence was a burden he had to explain away. And I didn't know it back then. But these small changes were leading me toward the night he would look me in the eyes, my own son, and tell me I didn't belong in his home. The night the rain poured. The night he closed the door. The night everything shattered. It didn't begin with shouting. It began with smiles, strained, polite, overly sweet smiles that hid something sharp underneath. She always behaved as if she were welcoming me, yet somehow every word left me feeling like I'd overstayed my welcome before I'd even arrived. The first moment I sensed her growing hostility was during a dinner they invited me to, one I later learned she never wanted me at in the first place. She greeted me with a quick, tight hug, and her perfume hit me before her warmth did. She pulled away too fast, brushing invisible dust off her dress as if my presence had disturbed it. "Beatrice, you made it," she said. "We weren't sure you'd come. Last-minute plans are hard at your age, aren't they?" A gentle smile, but her eyes were cold and assessing. My son didn't notice. He was too busy arranging plates, trying to keep the evening smooth. He kept asking if I needed anything: water, a cushion, a warmer seat, but she watched every interaction with a flicker of disapproval. When I complimented the food, she responded with a casual comment that stung more than she realized. "Oh, thank you. I wasn't sure you'd like it. You know, since you're so used to simpler dishes." Simpler. The word sat there, heavy, judging, coated with quiet superiority. I laughed it off, thinking perhaps I was being too sensitive. But the little jabs continued. When I spoke, she interrupted. When I tried helping, she insisted she had everything under control. When my son mentioned childhood memories, she looked away, bored, tapping her nails on the table. But it was the way she looked at him that troubled me most, like she owned not only his attention but all his choices, all his loyalties. Later that evening, as I stood to leave, she placed a hand on my arm. The smile on her face didn't match the message in her eyes. "You know," she whispered, "it's important for newlyweds to have space. Too much family, it can suffocate a marriage." I stared at her. She added softly, "Especially mothers who struggle to let go." I felt something collapse inside me, something silent yet devastating. Not because her words were cruel, they were, but because I saw then what I had refused to believe. She didn't want me around. Not occasionally, not less frequently, at all. And my son, blinded by new love, was drifting into the palm of someone who saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle standing in the way of the life she wanted to build. I walked home that night with a strange heaviness, sensing the shift, sensing the danger, sensing that I was being pushed out of my own child's world piece by piece, quietly, strategically, relentlessly. And I had no idea that this subtle war she'd begun would one day lead to the moment my son would stand in a rain-soaked doorway and tell me I didn't belong in his life anymore. The first time I realized it wasn't just subtle jabs or uncomfortable dinners was the night it all escalated into something unmistakable. By then, I had already felt the distance creeping in, the coldness growing in small increments, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that evening. I arrived at their home with a simple bag of groceries, thinking I could help. I had noticed that Daniel had been working late, and perhaps a warm meal would brighten the evening. But as soon as I stepped through the door, the atmosphere felt wrong. Lila's face tightened as soon as she saw me. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "Beatrice, can we talk?" I asked gently, sensing something was about to break. Her eyes flicked to my son, a warning there that I didn't understand at first. "We're fine," she said. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not even close. The first blow came disguised as casual conversation. "Mom, we were thinking it's probably time for you to consider living somewhere more independent," Daniel said, his voice careful, rehearsed. "Lila and I have a lot going on, and we need space." I stared at him, disbelief making my chest tighten. "Space?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've done nothing but care for you your entire life. I just need a place to stay for a few weeks until I sort things out." He sighed. A long, frustrated sigh. "Mom, it's complicated. It's not personal." "Not personal." Lila stepped closer then, her words smooth and deadly. "We just can't have you here right now. It makes Daniel uncomfortable. We're trying to keep things balanced." I wanted to argue. I wanted to cry. But the words stuck in my throat. I realized then that this wasn't about comfort, or timing, or inconvenience. This was about control. About making me invisible. About rewriting our family so I no longer had a place. The subtle betrayals I had brushed off before were now overt, almost cruel. They laughed quietly at dinner while I sat silent. My presence was treated as an irritation. My contributions dismissed. My love, my history, my sacrifices, erased with the lightest flick of her hand. And the worst part? Daniel didn't defend me. He nodded along. He avoided my gaze. He became the unwilling accomplice to the woman who had slowly, deliberately, made him forget who he had once been, the son who used to hold my hand, who once called me his anchor. By the time I left that night, I felt hollow. Not just hurt, erased. I knew then that the moment when he would finally push me away entirely was inevitable. And I also knew that when that day came, I couldn't stay silent. The storm was coming, and I had no idea how I would survive it, or what unexpected help would appear when I needed it most. The night it all broke apart is etched in my memory like a scar I can't forget. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets into a mirror of grey water and cold reflections. My suitcase, small and soaked, weighed heavily in my hand, but it wasn't the weight of my belongings that crushed me, it was the weight of abandonment. I stood on Daniel's porch, shivering, hoping that he would see me not as a problem, but as the mother who had raised him, loved him, and sacrificed everything for him. But when the door swung open, I realized just how far we had drifted. Daniel stood there, arms crossed, his face tight, almost foreign. "Mom, you can't stay here. You'll only make things harder," he said. Harder. The word hit me like a blow. I felt my chest tighten, my knees wobble, and my heart sink deeper than I thought it could go. My suitcase sat between us like a barrier, a monument to decades of devotion now treated as an obstacle. "I raised you alone," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Where am I supposed to go?" He didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He just looked at me with that strange mixture of guilt and discomfort that had been growing for months. Behind him, Lila stood, arms folded, lips pressed together, watching me like I was a visitor from a life she was determined to erase. I felt a shiver run through me, not from the rain, but from the stark realization that this was no accident, no lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. Calculated. A removal, piece by piece, of my place in their lives. The door edged closer, almost as if it were an extension of his resolve. Closer, until finally, with a soft but final click, it shut in my face. I stood there trembling, rain pouring down, chest aching with a hurt that words could never hold. The son who once clung to my hand, who had whispered in the dark that I was his anchor, had now turned his back and closed the door. My legs felt weak, my heart hollow. And yet, through the numbness, I noticed movement from the house next door. A figure, tall and composed, had seen it all. Daniel's boss. He didn't hesitate. He came to me, offering warmth, shelter, a kind word when all I had known was rejection. He saw the truth of what had happened, the injustice, the betrayal, and he acted. Standing there, dripping and cold, I realized something I hadn't known in years. Help could come from the most unexpected places. And if I survived this night, it wouldn't just be about enduring, it would be about reclaiming my dignity, my voice, and the respect I had earned but never demanded. That night, in the rain, I understood fully that my son's betrayal wasn't the end, it was the spark that would ignite everything I had been holding back. And I knew, deep inside, that I could no longer be silent. This was the moment I knew I had to do something. After that night in the rain, I knew I couldn't let myself be erased quietly. I spent hours replaying the door, my son's cold voice, the way Lila had positioned herself like a barrier between us. Anger bubbled beneath the sorrow, but it wasn't blind rage, it was clarity. I understood that if I wanted respect, if I wanted to reclaim my place in this family, I had to act carefully, smartly, and with purpose. The first step was observation. I started paying attention, not out of malice, but out of necessity. I noticed how my son deferred to Lila constantly, how he avoided conflict to keep her comfortable. I saw her little manipulations, the subtle ways she controlled conversation, nudged him toward decisions that suited her ambitions, made me feel small and unwelcome. I didn't let it intimidate me. Instead, I stored it, planning how truth could be revealed without me losing dignity in the process. I reached out to someone I hadn't expected, his boss, the man who had witnessed that fateful night from next door. Quietly, he listened. He didn't lecture, didn't judge. He simply offered a safe space to regroup, to plan, and to find an outlet for the injustice I had endured. He reminded me that respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And that sometimes, letting the world see the truth is more powerful than confrontation. I started small. Gentle acts that highlighted the reality Daniel and Lila had tried to ignore. I volunteered openly in the community, gained recognition for my dedication, and rebuilt my social circle in ways they couldn't influence. Invitations came for events they couldn't attend, where neighbors whispered stories of my kindness and resilience. Slowly, my absence from their home became a visible, irreplaceable presence elsewhere. Then I confronted subtle lies head-on, but indirectly. Through mutual friends and careful timing, I allowed small truths to surface. The choices Daniel and Lila had made, avoiding family, dismissing me, treating me as invisible, became noticeable to those whose opinion mattered. Without me saying a word, the imbalance of their household was revealed. People began to notice the coldness, the manipulation, the disrespect. The most satisfying moment wasn't vengeance, it was justice. The world saw the patterns, my dignity remained intact, and my voice reclaimed the place it had lost. My son began to feel the weight of his decisions, finally realizing what he had allowed and what he had forsaken. Lila's control over him became less certain, her power diminished, and the family dynamic shifted in a way that was natural, earned, and deserved. For the first time in months, I felt strength. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't broken. I was seen. And I knew that I had turned betrayal into a quiet, clever triumph. The days that followed were quiet, yet charged with the weight of truth finally emerging. My son began to notice the subtle shifts he could no longer ignore. Invitations to social events, whispered compliments from neighbors, and the unexpected recognition I received in our community made him realize the world hadn't stopped when he tried to push me away, it had simply opened its eyes to what he had taken for granted. Lila's control, which had once seemed absolute, began to falter. The people around her, friends, co-workers, even mutual acquaintances, started to recognize the tension she had cultivated, the coldness she projected. They could see it wasn't me who was overstepping boundaries, it was her manipulation that had forced a wedge between mother and son. One afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was hesitant, softer than I had heard in months. "Mom, I see things differently now. I didn't realize how much I hurt you." I listened quietly, my heart heavy but not naive. "It wasn't easy for me either," I said. "But the past can't be erased. We can only learn from it." He hesitated again, and I knew he was finally processing the consequences of his choices. There was no dramatic apology, no sudden embrace of reconciliation, only the slow, careful understanding that his actions had repercussions. And sometimes, that is the truest kind of justice. Meanwhile, I continued building my own life. The recognition, the friendships, and the small victories I had cultivated became more than just validation. They were reminders that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. My dignity, my voice, and my independence had returned, unshakable. The household that had tried to erase me was still intact, but the balance had shifted. My son now understood the weight of his decisions, and Lila's influence was no longer unchallenged. The power dynamic had corrected itself, quietly but irrevocably. In the end, I didn't need revenge to be loud or dramatic. I simply needed the truth to be seen, and in that, I had won. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Looking back, I realize now that betrayal often comes quietly, disguised as subtle words, small actions, or careful omissions. It doesn't always arrive with anger or confrontation. Sometimes, it creeps in, almost imperceptibly, until one day you find yourself standing alone, questioning everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. But the lesson I learned, and the lesson I hope my story reminds others of, is this: your worth is never defined by the recognition or approval of those who take you for granted. True respect is earned through integrity, resilience, and the courage to stand firm when life turns cold. I also learned that help can come from the most unexpected places. When you feel abandoned by those you love, sometimes a stranger, a friend, or even someone who witnesses the truth quietly can become the lifeline that reminds you of your value. Revenge is not about cruelty or tearing others down, it's about reclaiming your dignity, asserting your voice, and allowing the consequences of actions to speak for themselves. Justice, when measured in clarity and balance, is far more satisfying than anger or resentment ever could be. I hope my story reminds you never to underestimate yourself, never to accept subtle erasure, and never to forget that strength can be quiet, patient, and unshakable. In the end, I survived betrayal, reclaimed my life, and found peace not in confrontation, but in the quiet power of being seen and respected for who I truly am.